Hi guys! This video is going to be what I'd call a pure fun video. It's not cynically trying to garner views, since this channel has not too many subscribers and this video isn't hot off the presses, and it's definitely not an attempt to add something productive to a discussion I genuinely think is worth having. If this video was intended to reflect my respect for the arguments made and what I'm responding to, then it would be non-existent. Of course, the fact that I'm starting off by saying this video has no meaningful aspirations means I'm completely free to take cheap shots without feeling like I'm lowering the tone. I'm just tired of these Leftube losers who spend 30 minutes dancing around any sort of meaningful point before actually even getting into the swing of being wrong. I have this rule about certain low-budget, crappy horror movies that you might as well just skip 30 minutes in, because the low budget means that anything exciting is unlikely to happen until later on into the runtime, and thus everything up until that point will be lame cliché character development. Therefore, since nothing worthwhile will happen in the first 30 minutes, you might as well just skip it. Basically what I'm doing right now is comparing your average Leftube video to a film like Zombies vs Strippers, albeit slightly more misogynistic. But for real, these videos are so formulaic that a half-decent AI could replace these dudes. Step 1, start off by introducing the topic through a silly over-the-top sketch. Step 2, chapter title tiles. I don't know what else to call these things. Step 3, introduce the topic with reference to various think pieces. Step 4, identify a particular facet of the larger topic as a means to understand it. Step 5, introduce a handful of contemporary thinkers on the subject. Step 6, introduce one specific thinker from 200 years ago.
The writer and polymath Gustave Le Bon.
And so on and so on. I'm sure I could find other examples, but I also expect you don't need me to, because what I'm saying sounds familiar enough. Indeed, I'd imagine there's a decent enough chance you haven't even seen the video I'm responding to, and yet you can already get close to it in your head just based on that description. And I would genuinely be interested to ask a fan of this channel, who watched this video, what the first 30 minutes were about. Just sit them down and say, alright, you liked the video, now what points were made in the first 30 minutes? Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the person couldn't give a response at all, and I'd certainly expect a substantial hesitation. However, I'd say the majority would arrive at the general summary: fear of mobs has historically been used to silence collective action. And then the next natural question is, should it have taken 30 minutes to make that point? Like, even in my most verbose response series, responding to ContraPoints' Turf's video, each video only runs half an hour in length. And on the occasion where I fail to cover more than one statement of Contras, like in the last video, it's because that one statement genuinely takes half an hour to really debunk. Again, taking that last video as an example, I had to start off with a foundation in precisely how reproductive capacity is the origin for women's oppression, then challenge the implication that how gender is currently viewed can override its historical use, before then getting to whether or not society does ignore reproductive capacity when treating people like women.
Well, even if reproductive control is the original reason patriarchy oppresses women, reproductive capacity is not the criterion society uses when it comes to treating people like women or men.
So within 30 minutes, I was able to do all that, and that was me being verbose and circumlocutory in my presentation. Meanwhile, with 30 minutes here, we get what basically amounts to nothing. So I'm going to only start seriously responding to this video at the hour-and-a-half mark, which is the point where things get a bit more interesting.
Whenever there have been instances of mass collective action, it has served as a way of drawing attention away from the reasons that have inspired people to join in with that action, and as a means to encouraging us to view the arguments that they've made as inherently unworthy of our time and thought.
And this is why I find it really funny that 30 minutes is spent trying to demonstrate the point I summarized earlier in one sentence, because now we're going to get this statement as a bridge to talking about contemporary cancel culture. I find this style of manipulation very interesting. I think maybe it's like the sunk cost fallacy. What a video does is spend 30 minutes talking about some general concept and then suggests that this concept helps to explain a different concept. It's sort of a bait and switch, but the point is that if the video had started off with a brief 5-minute remark about how historically fear of mobs has been used to silence the oppressed masses, and then proceeded to try and use this as a parallel to reactions to contemporary cancel culture, then far fewer people would buy that as a convincing argument. Like if I said, women fighting for the vote used to be dismissed as an angry mob, and on that note, isn't that a bit like when Twitter campaigned to have a wrestler fired from Star Wars because she repeated some admittedly dangerous falsehoods about the US election results and made a poor taste comparison to the Holocaust? I think it's safe to say that regardless of your opinions on Gina Carano, you'd probably think, hang on mate, that sounds like a tiny bit of a load of complete nonsense there. You wouldn't find it remotely convincing as a parallel. Now, the sunk cost fallacy refers to the idea that once we're invested in something, we are then more likely to accept the validity of that thing. So, for example, if I spend 30 minutes setting up this idea of the mob being something that is often criticized by powerful elite reactionaries, then the audience is now invested in the idea that this will in some way be relevant to the rest of the video. They've just spent 30 minutes of a 45-minute video that has amounted to nothing more than communicating this fact. So when the video then transitions to talking about cancel culture through the parallel of the oppressed masses being dismissed, the audience are being told, yes, the reason you spent 30 minutes listening to me prattle on about that thing is because it parallels directly to modern cancel culture. And the audience then, due to the sunk cost fallacy, says, I guess that must be true. Of course, the funny thing is that the argument has not got any more convincing than it was in my incredibly simplistic rephrasing of it, to just plainly suggest there is some equivalence between the quelling of social reform movements in the 19th century and the contemporary calls to drive Kevin Hart off Twitter. The argument remains exactly the same, but the only difference is the performance. I've said it before, and I'll be darned if I don't say it again, but I'd say 50% of what I'm generously going to call my job on this channel is not responding to arguments, but performances designed to appeal to the non-reasoning parts of people's brains.
Whenever someone invokes the idea of cancel culture, they tend to appear to have a specific supposed cancelling in mind. And yet, by centering the conversation on cancel culture, rather than focusing on the specific event which has provoked them to speak on the topic.
Okay, so this literally isn't true, or at least it's very misleading. It's insinuating within the wider context of the video that people are pretending to criticize the broader idea of cancel culture while really only invested in the cancelling of one particular idea. This is what's not true. The greatest consistency when it comes to criticizing cancel culture is that people have whatever the most recent cancelling was in mind. Like, when Dave Chappelle got bad reviews for his comedy show because of it being too edgy, people decried that as cancel culture. When ContraPoints got attacked on Twitter for criticizing aspects of politics around trans people, people decried that as cancel culture, even while people like myself felt little sympathy for Contra as an individual. When J.K. Rowling criticized aspects of politics around trans people and was attacked on Twitter, people decried that as cancel culture. Most recently, when Gina Carano was attacked on Twitter and fired from her job for some edgy social media posts, people decried that as cancel culture. So, two things to note here. Firstly, the only specificity in people's criticisms of cancel culture is that the focus will tend to be on the most recent instance of cancel culture. Like, most people I see talking about cancel culture right now aren't really doing so with reference to J.K. Rowling, because the J.K. Rowling cancellation is a bit old and is beginning to fade into the broader context of cancelling as a phenomenon. So that's exactly what we'd expect if the focus was more on cancelling as a phenomenon rather than specific cases. Specific cases will be the focus when they're most recent, but usually with reference to the wider phenomenon, including past examples of cancelling, and then those cases will themselves become part of past examples for the wider phenomenon as time marches on and new cases emerge. Now secondly, there's the fact that, as I already said, most people I've seen criticise cancel culture have been quite consistent in criticising cancel culture even when disliking the person being cancelled and even the things that they said. Like, when ContraPoints was being cancelled, even amongst people who disliked ContraPoints, if they had previously criticised cancel culture, the general consensus was, holy crap, I can't believe the Twitter mob has even cancelled ContraPoints now. I also made reference to the fact that you can see how silly the cancelling of Gina Carano was, regardless of your opinion on her. And when it comes to J.K. Rowling, I have been vocal about the fact that I don't actually particularly endorse her contribution to the trans debate. I think that by failing to explicitly come out and say that being a woman is a biological thing, instead just making vague references to the significance of biology, Rowling is failing to centre what really matters, which is that how woman is defined should matter and should be something that any woman can take a strong stance on without being attacked. Thus, when I talk about J.K. Rowling, personally, it's rarely with the specific desire to defend Rowling. It's mostly to deal with the surrounding conversations that J.K. has facilitated, and mostly with reference to the fact that I wish the conversation was about something else. I mean, in my response to ContraPoints on J.K. Rowling, I really didn't mention Rowling that much at all. And regarding Rowling more generally, I do dislike the way that J.K. Rowling has handled representation in her books. I don't like how she has chosen to out characters as gay, but not substantiated that within the narrative of the books. It is sort of gross to me that a contemporary blockbuster is still afraid to have Dumbledore be presented as obviously gay in the Fantastic Beasts films, and I do think that it does give an opportunity for people to challenge JK's credentials as a sincere progressive when she has been so wishy-washy when it comes to her politics around LGBT issues in the past. Having no gay representation at all would arguably be better than having no discernible gay representation and then insisting a character was in fact gay after the fact. And just as an aside, I don't like J.K. Rowling that much as a fiction writer. Like, a while ago on this channel I did start reviewing the Harry Potter films and gave up because the editing and scripting was more work than it was worth for the views, and then nowadays a film review would go against the branding of this channel. However, long story short is I don't really think the Wizarding World franchise is that great. So in conclusion, there's no sense in which me being against a given instance of cancelling translates to me having some desire to defend a specific individual being cancelled. Generally what I'm against is the familiar mob mentality that has seen everybody from ContraPoints to J.K. Rowling being attacked for some kind of wrongthink. So this idea that people who criticize cancel culture are actually trying to secretly only counter some given instance of cancel culture is basically dead on arrival, which is unfortunate when some degree of the rest of the video is reliant on accepting this claim.
It was simply easier to disparage those campaigning for such reforms as unruly and irrational mobs. The added benefit being that doing so didn't run the risk of legitimising the grievances and hopes of these movements as being worthy of debate. The term cancel culture, as I see it, operates in a very similar way.
So again, this is reliant on accepting the association between historical anxieties around workers' rights and cancelling on Twitter. As I've already said, nobody would accept that association if it weren't for the manipulative framing of this video. I do just want to point out a few extra things. Firstly, the association with fights for workers' rights in the 19th century is particularly ironic because the most consistent opponents of cancel culture, I would say, have been Marxists. And I say consistently not necessarily to mean most fervent, but rather most unbiased and objective in their oppositions. I would generally say that conservatives, for example, are more likely to have a cancel culture for thee but not for me attitude, although I will stress on this point, I am willing to accept that a decent number of conservative opponents of cancel culture are consistent precisely because, as I already said, the general discussion I've seen around cancel culture has had the general concept of cancel culture be the central focus, without any mind to the specifics of the individual being cancelled. But of course, the reason why Marxists oppose cancel culture is pretty obvious. Cancel culture tends to be an extension of social capital. Those who are most adept at avoiding being cancelled are most likely to be university-educated white middle-class and upper-class people. My dad left school at 14 and got an engineering apprenticeship. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't know that person of colour is far more socially acceptable than coloured person. I, on the other hand, as a beneficiary of my parents' upward social mobility, was able to go to university and learn about cis-heteronormative post-colonial white patriarchy. Moreover, cancel culture tends to extend from identity politics. Cancel culture isn't about class solidarity for the oppressed masses, it's mostly about exacerbating divides in society by taking any small misstep on a particular point and blowing it totally out of proportion. It's not Marxists with a focus on material reality who are angry that Dave Chappelle jokingly referred to LGBTQIs as the alphabet people. Generally speaking, it's liberals and postmodernists who are obsessed with identity, so I'm not sure where this association with the working class is coming from. But see, I would actually argue that the whole point about cancel culture, and one that obviously Nicholas fails to address at all, is that it's not continuous with other fights against oppression. The whole point about cancel culture is that the fight of these people should be delegitimized, because usually what they're fighting against is not worth it. When somebody makes a flippant reference to the Holocaust, the appropriate response is to say, whoa, that's a bit over the top, not to get them fired and irrevocably impact their livelihoods. In fact, if cancel culture was actually continuous with those movements, you would expect to see it being treated in a way that was continuous with those movements, because we do have movements today that are similar to the fights for rights in the 19th century. Indigenous people in North America fighting for their land against big corporations, Chinese reformers fighting for democracy and more human rights, women in the Muslim world fighting for freedom from the hijab or female genital mutilation, Palestinians opposing Israeli settlement in the West Bank and Gaza. There is still relatively contemporary opposition to wealth inequality that has taken the form of mass collective action. These examples are varied and diverse intentionally. I'd imagine people might debate to varying degrees the legitimacy of these movements. However, significantly, none of them are called cancel culture. None of them are dismissed simply on the grounds of being mobs. I've heard debates about all of these topics, and I've never heard any of these groups be dismissed simply for the fact that they are mobs. So if the idea of cancel culture extends from the time when reflexive dismissal of collective action was the go-to way of dealing with people's legitimate grievances, why aren't any of these movements, some of which we must accept surely have some legitimate grievances, dismissed simply for being mobs? It seems like the only time that mass collective action is dismissed as violent, irrational, mob-like behavior in the modern world is precisely when that's what's happening. So with all of that said, I think we're pretty clear on the fact that fear of the mob isn't used to delegitimize legitimate concerns, and we can see that because so many far more legitimate concerns than some comedians saying an edgy joke are not delegitimized with reference to the mob.
Let's take the example of one of the higher profile cases of a supposed cancelling. The backlash against J.K. Rowling's increasingly confident and proud transphobia.
Look, I'm just going to point out two things with reference to this characterization of J.K. Rowling as a transphobe. Firstly, that disagreeing with the identity of transgender individuals is not transphobic. It's simply holding to an alternative definition of gender. Secondly, that while J.K. Rowling has implied affiliation to people who hold to such definitions of gender, to my knowledge, J.K. Rowling hasn't even come out and disagreed with how transgender individuals identify themselves. So even the things she could have done that might be considered a more extreme objection to trans activism, she hasn't even done, and it wouldn't be transphobic even if she did. So it's just a bit difficult to recognize any sort of transphobia here.
There is, of course, a more basic question to be asked here about whether someone who, at time of recording, has a book at number 1 on the New York Times bestsellers list can be meaningfully said to have been cancelled.
So sometimes I go to bed in the middle of writing scripts, and then I struggle to fall asleep, which is a general issue for me. But then what happens is I start thinking about the video I'm working on responding to, and I keep coming up with new reasons why what's being said is stupid. And because I'm worried I'll forget them, I write them down in a notepad by my bed. One time this got so bad that it reached 2:30 in the morning, and I still hadn't gotten to sleep, so I just decided to boot up my laptop again and write the script in bed, eventually falling asleep at 4:30. On a side note, I'm actually convinced that time is the principal factor that limits the lengths of my responses, because I tend to find that the longer I think about something a gender identity extremist has said, the more things I can come up with that are wrong with it. So let's just explain why this is wrong. Firstly, cancelling assumes a large audience anyway. Saying, well, how can we say this person has been cancelled when they have lots of followers, makes absolutely no sense. Because that's what cancelled means. Cancelled means somebody being attacked who is otherwise in a position of acclaim. Nobody talks about cancelling the Westboro Baptist Church because the Westboro Baptist Church isn't popular to begin with. Apply this to any example you see fit. It communicates the basic point. When somebody says a given individual has been cancelled, they're assuming this person has millions of followers, probably some kind of position that gives them influence, as well as a very decent amount of money. These things, far from precluding the possibility of somebody being cancelled, are basically preconditions. Now, you could argue that actually, yes, these things are necessary for somebody to be cancelled, but the act of having been cancelled should then leave people without these things. However, at this point, you're literally just arguing a point of grammar. Like, sure, J.K. Rowling has technically not been cancelled since she's still incredibly popular. So if you're going to make the argument that the D at the end requires that somebody is no longer culturally relevant because they have been cancelled, then fair enough. However, it seems pretty obvious that being cancelled isn't implying something in the past tense anyway. And of course, this whole debate about whether or not you can claim to be cancelled if you still have a prominent platform is kind of immaterial anyway, because we can all agree that there are people out there who want J.K. Rowling to not have a platform. There are people who are literally attributing the writing of Harry Potter to fictional characters because they want to deny JK the credit for the work she's produced. These people want J.K. Rowling so cancelled that even as Harry Potter might still be a part of the pop culture, its association with J.K. would be completely gone. And the key thing is, cancel culture as a term tends to be with reference to the people doing the cancelling, not the people being cancelled. As such, it really shouldn't matter whether the person in question has been reduced to the complete fringes of show business, Roseanne Barr style, or still very much wealthy and popular and heading up multimedia franchises J.K. Rowling style. After all, criticisms of cancel culture tend to not really focus on the specifics of the individual being cancelled, because cancel culture is a criticism of the culture. So again, to reiterate, the effects on the cancelled individual is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is what it says about the people doing the cancelling, that they are trying to make these people irrelevant for their honest opinions or a joke. I don't think this guy is that smart, but I think even he doesn't really mean that we can honestly act as if somebody being successful precludes pointing to their experience to understand the concept of cancel culture. That's probably why he sort of just says it as an aside, but I don't like to just let stupid things be said just because they're said as an aside. I leave no stone unturned.
The manner in which those defending Rowling so often try to move the conversation towards being about the broad notion of cancel culture works to tacitly discourage people from actually looking into the things that she said and from actually considering whether there might be any evidentiary basis for her spurious claims that the happiness and basic safety of trans people conflicts with that of cis women.
So yeah, this is when the video gets really stupid. So far we've seen that what this guy has said has consistently been the opposite to the truth. He claimed that there was some obvious and evident parallel between the silencing of popular uprisings in the 19th century and contemporary cancel culture, and obviously we've seen that this is just not true at all, and that many popular uprisings that are far more similar to those 19th century uprisings are not considered cancel culture, not attacked in and of themselves for being popular uprisings, and indeed we have reason to imagine that the theoretical underpinnings of these movements would have been entirely at odds with cancel culture. Somebody just turned on an Extractor fan, which is great. He claimed that most people who talk about cancel culture tend to secretly have a specific cancelling in mind, which they then obfuscate for ulterior motives. We've seen that most people who complain about cancel culture tend to be very much focusing on cancel culture as a general phenomenon, and quite consistently the only specific cancelling they may have in mind would be whatever is the most recent high-profile cancelling, which is exactly what we'd expect if the criticism was of the general phenomenon. He said that J.K. Rowling is transphobic, and it's pretty difficult to get around the fact that she's about a country mile away from even approaching any reasonable definition of transphobia. And of course, he suggested that continued success implies that somebody hasn't really been cancelled, and we've seen that actually the entire idea of cancel culture assumes that the person being cancelled must have at least some degree of success. Now, I'll say to this guy's credit that he is building an inductive argument, where he's making assertions and drawing different claims together to form a larger, grander argument. The only issue is that his assertions are complete bunk. So when he claims that people talking about cancel culture with reference to J.K. Rowling are trying to avoid focusing on the specifics of what she said, firstly, we can immediately conclude that's not true because, like we've already established, most people who criticize cancel culture don't do so with reference to one specific individual to defend that one specific person's ideas. Slight humorous side note, I would enjoy it if this was all being said with reference to the Roseanne Barr cancellation, like the exact same tone and thesis, but about whether or not some random politician looks like she's from Planet of the Apes. I joke, but that does kind of get to the point. A pretty large number of cancellations have been with reference to jokes, so when this guy suggested that J.K. Rowling was just a random example, well, that was kind of a lie, because with almost any other instance of high-profile cancellation, he couldn't really spew this nonsense about not wanting people to look into the claims being made, because most other cancellations were just jokes people got offended by. So if we were to accept that the whole notion of JK being cancelled is some scheme to stop people critically evaluating the things that she said, then this would have to be an exception rather than a rule anyway. Now, aside from this, you have the simple irony of suggesting that it's the people who don't want JK to be cancelled who are trying to take away the focus from the things she's actually said. I'm not aware of a single piece of evidence to suggest this, and there is at least some evidence to the contrary in that J.K. Rowling won the Russell Prize for her essay and the thing that she said in the essay. In fact, one of the most enduring defenses I hear of J.K. Rowling is, read her essay. It's not a transphobic screed, it's a clear series of objections she has to contemporary trans activism. It's just honestly so hilariously stupid to suggest it's the people who want a free and open debate that are also trying to take the focus away from the things that are being said in that debate. Is this serious? I also just want to focus on this line.
Whilst those seeking to defend Rowling often do agree with her transphobic rhetoric, guiding the conversation towards this vague notion of cancel culture enables them to defend the author without having to do the hard work of actually piecing together a defence of the specific things that she said and written.
So I could have ignored the last statement if I thought that the claim being made was that the people who talk more generally about cancel culture don't want to put the emphasis on the specifics of what JK has said. This would be a correct but completely pointless observation. Obviously, the people who are only interested in this debate from the perspective of cancel culture are not going to care about the specific things JK has said. However, here, Nicholas claims that actually it's the people who agree with JK's views on gender that are trying to defend her without having to actually defend the things she said. And I just want to say, is this guy a complete moron? I mean, he is, obviously, but for real, this is so bad. Like, I don't need to respond to this. It's so obviously not true. The people who could most accurately be described as agreeing with JK's view on gender would be gender-critical people and mostly what I'd call gender-critical light people, which is to say, people who would probably say at least some trans women are women, but that they have other peripheral concerns relating to sex and gender. That is, of course, JK's position herself. It's also the anti-trans activist position you see most often in the media and the political sphere. It's only really on the internet where you'll hear people comfortably say, no, it doesn't make sense to define gender by identity, so trans women aren't women. That's the pure gender-critical position. But if we just focus on the gender-critical light people for a second, they love J.K. Rowling's essay. And most of J.K. Rowling's essay is just reiterating what have always been talking points since before J.K. even wrote her essay. So how on earth can you claim that they don't want to defend the things J.K. has said, when the whole reason she said those things is because she encountered people who have been defending those things already, which convinced her of that position? Now, I do want to say that it is true that people like me have said we don't want to be roped into defending JK's essay line by line, because we don't necessarily agree with all of it. But obviously the argument Nicholas is making here is that there are some people somewhere who agree with parts of the essay, but don't want to actually defend those beliefs, so they talk about cancel culture instead. The only possible actual example I could maybe begin to imagine of this sort of being true would be some conservative personalities who... But even then, that doesn't make sense, because conservative personalities definitely do talk about their views on trans people all the time. So sure, you could maybe say that they're being especially disingenuous in defending JK, seeing as they don't believe in even the vague thrust of JK's arguments as a progressive, but then at the same time, conservatives mostly just defend JK from a free speech perspective. And then when it comes to their actual view on trans people, which have a more conservative bent, they stick with those views. So I just don't understand what point this person could possibly be trying to make right now. Apparently, there are people out there who are focusing on J.K. Rowling being cancelled, but really, the reason they're focusing on that is because they agree with Rowling's views expressed on the subject, but they don't want to actually express agreement, because they think defending the stuff JK has said would be hard, so they want to take the focus away from those things, and meanwhile, presumably, it's the cancel culture mob that wants to put the focus on the things JK has actually said. And it feels like every other claim there is wrong. So just for the record, here's the actual reality. There are people focusing on JK being cancelled, but in broad terms, the reason they're focusing on it is because JK is just the most high-profile case of cancel culture. The people who do agree with JK's specific views tend to willfully express that agreement independent of references to cancel culture, and most people don't think defending the stuff JK has said would be that hard, unless they themselves disagree with some of the specifics she has said. But either way, one of the most enduring requests during the time of JK's cancelling has been to just look at the things that she said, and you'll see they're not particularly transphobic. And by contrast, it's the cancel culture mob that are so adverse to the idea of having a debate on this topic. And I think most people will be able to identify that the latter description of events there best reflects reality.
Cancel culture encourages us to view all instances in which someone receives online backlash for their words or actions as essentially the same.
Okay, so I actually want to talk about a point of agreement here. Not with reference to cancel culture, but with reference to free speech. See, I've always wanted to do a video on free speech on this channel. Like, it's been an idea I've had in my mind almost since I started, but a combination of factors kept me from making it. Firstly, I've actually intentionally held off making quite a few videos that I genuinely wanted to make because I was aware that my channel didn't have that many subs. So I figured I'd wait until the videos I wanted to make would get viewed by more people. Secondly, I wanted it to be very good, which would have not only required lots of careful and purposeful scripting and editing, but also some decent production values. And thirdly, because there was just usually some other thing going on which I felt could get more views. Thus, this video never got made, and possibly won't ever get made now that my channel has come to have a more specific focus. But basically, the video was going to be pointing out that free speech absolutism is often not really defended very well, and doesn't make much sense. In short, because a recurring suggestion around the idea of free speech is that you can't distinguish between free speech that should be legally permitted and speech that shouldn't. This is taken self-evidently, and indeed we even see it in this South Park episode which I hate that's all about free speech.
Then you've made a distinction between what is okay to poke fun at and what isn't. Either it's all okay, or none of it is.
Which doesn't really make any sense at all. Like, firstly, why does this logic apply to words but not actions? I don't see why that would self-evidently be the case. But even ignoring that, this logic doesn't even apply to words consistently anyway. Supposedly, we can't draw distinctions between what's acceptable when it comes to the law or platforming, but we easily can in other contexts. Like, I know what is and isn't socially acceptable in a given situation. I'm not going to start talking about gangbangs in front of my grandparents and then be like, whoa, either everything must be okay socially or nothing must be. More significantly, I know what's morally acceptable. There are plenty of morally suspect things I could say right now, and I imagine most people wouldn't even think twice before calling those things immoral. They certainly wouldn't sit there and think, well, either this thing being said right now is morally acceptable, or else everything being said ever is morally unacceptable. That just doesn't make any sense. Also, on the subject of stupid lines about free speech from cartoons,
how can you be for one form of freedom of expression like our big naked friend over there, and be against another form like Itchy and Scratchy? Good question.
Well, I guess I can't.
That's literally so stupid. How can you be against one form of expression, but in support of another? As if what's being expressed is itself immaterial. So yeah, that's kind of a truncated version of what this potential video would have been about. This idea that free speech has to be this absolute thing actually makes absolutely no sense. And I'm not saying you can't support absolute free speech. I'm just saying it's not some self-evidently correct thing in the way that a lot of people seem to present it. So, shock horror, I kind of agree with the general vague point that our good friend Nicholas is getting at. Yes, it's true that a big focus on the supposed universal acceptability of saying something arguably detracts from being honest about the fact that we can actually identify discrepancies in the acceptability of certain things that are being said. But that's talking about the general idea of free speech, and I'm not convinced this same logic applies to cancel culture. Because generally, cancel culture arguably focuses on two key areas. Firstly, comedy, where a strong argument can be made that cancelling people for being offensive is pretty silly, and secondly, intellectual positions on things. Obviously, in the latter case, you could make a very strong argument that as long as somebody is just saying that they think something based on evidence and arguments is true, the appropriate response is to challenge their evidence and arguments, rather than to launch a moral attack against their character. Because on the surface, it's generally true that not only does taking people's arguments seriously rather than attacking their character avoid potentially being unfair to them, as is the case with J.K. Rowling, but I'd also argue that sometimes taking people's arguments seriously rather than allowing it to become a moral debate is a more effective way to counter bad ideas. Like, people say we shouldn't platform race realism and take it seriously, but I generally find that nothing is more effective at embarrassing race realists than just saying, okay, let's have a serious talk about why your views would be better for society, and then tearing apart their reasoning in that regard. So with that said, this isn't free speech, which applies to literally everything. Cancel culture is a very specific thing, which tends to focus on the areas where the notion of being allowed to express absolutely any view should be the most welcome. Comedy and honest academic debate. Now, does the idea of cancel culture keep people from looking into the evidential merits of the things being cancelled? Well, no. I would argue it isn't the idea of cancel culture that does this, but cancel culture itself. If cancel culture wasn't a thing, then people would have just responded to J.K. Rowling by not making personal attacks and calling her a bigot and trying to remove her from association with her own creative work, and would have instead simply engaged the arguments he made. So if cancel culture didn't exist, then we could all agree that certain statements may have varying degrees of evidence and also be to varying degrees morally acceptable. If people didn't immediately jump down a comedian's throat for saying an offensive joke, maybe we could have an honest debate about the moral implications of certain subjects for comedy. Meanwhile, the idea of cancel culture, and those who advocate against it, can't really be said to ignore the variable legitimacy and ethics of different things being cancelled. I mean, the most recent example of cancelling is Gina Carano, and I've literally said that I disagree with the cancelling while simultaneously disagreeing with a lot of the things she has done. Spreading the false notion that the election was rigged makes you a useful idiot in the fascist coup of a moronic conman. Comparing the treatment of conservatives to Jews in Hitler's Germany is just a poor taste analogy to make. Not an uncommon one, but poor taste. So am I saying that these things shouldn't have been criticised? You know, those two things I just criticised? No. I think they should have been. However, do I think it makes sense for a massive mob to descend upon this one particular individual, calling for them to be stripped of their livelihood? Not really, no. Indeed, I'm pretty sure if presented with most examples of what are generally considered to have been cancellings, I would disagree with the cancelling in question, while also having a variety of different takes when it comes to specifically what was said leading up to the cancelling. So, is it possible that obsessing over the rights of people to express their opinions can lead to people ignoring how there can be pretty obvious distinctions drawn in terms of the validity of different opinions? Sure. Does that generally appear to be evidenced in examples of complaining about cancel culture? No. So when you hear statements like this,
the whole cancel culture hypothesis relies upon the complete stripping away of detail and nuance.
It makes you do a double take. I realise this video is quite long for something that I've admitted up front serves very little purpose, so I'm just going to present what's being said here and let you fill in the rest in terms of how stupid and wrong this is. Apparently, it's the people who are opposing the mass Twitter mob cancellations that are the ones who are trying to strip away every detail and nuance. I leave you to ponder the logic there.
Retaining that nuance is important if we're to have meaningful conversations about how we want our public sphere to operate.
Right, yes. You seem to have wrongly concluded that people who disagree with cancel culture aren't doing so precisely because they've concluded that instances of cancel culture fall into the latter category.
Rowling is, therefore, every bit as much part of a mob as those who criticise her. It is simply that a choice has been made in how to tell the story of her radicalisation and the criticisms that it has engendered.
Right, so again, if I were to quibble every single word here, like radicalization, this video would be even longer. Considering nothing of value was said in the first 30 minutes, this video manages to pack a lot of wrong into the last 15 minutes. However, I needed to keep this video moderately short, so I'm only going to focus on the more meaningful wrong statements. So obviously, this guy just doesn't know what mobs are. J.K. Rowling supporters aren't a mob. Firstly, because they're a very disparate group of people with varying opinions on both her and transgender politics in general. Secondly, because they aren't banding together really seeking any sort of collective action, and finally, because they're certainly not doing so from a position of furious anger and rage. Like, there isn't an equivalence between the people calling for J.K. Rowling to be cancelled in all the ways that they are, and the people just standing by J.K. Rowling to varying degrees. This is really obvious, and I can't believe it needs to be pointed out.
Phrases like the LGBTQ+ community or the black community, to point to just a couple of examples, can be powerful adhesives when used by people within those communities to organise, but they can also be used carelessly or maliciously by outsiders in ways which infer a level of homogeneity to the concerns and experiences of the countless individuals who make up those groups.
I just want to say that I find this comment about the LGBTQ+ community to be funny because you have organisations like the LGBT Alliance that are literally called hateful just because they want to organise around sexuality without an association with the gender identity politics of transgender activism. So Nicholas frames being able to organise around groups as a good thing and suggests this is something which people on the opposite side of the debate are against, but actually in the progressive left, there are only certain groups that are allowed to be organised apparently.
We would also do well to be sceptical of the notion that those who present themselves as completely disconnected individuals are inherently and extraordinarily rational. For recent years seem to have seen a rising tide of contrarianism in our culture.
I just want to say that it's definitely true that having a unique viewpoint actually is generally a pretty promising sign that somebody is smart. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that if somebody is just a progressive liberal with no discernible variation from the standard progressive liberal rhetoric, that this person is not going to be worth having a discussion with. However, if this person has a unique view on any kind of issue, then that tells me that they've probably thought about their views to some degree. And indeed, when you look at somebody like Dave Rubin, the problem with Dave Rubin isn't that he's stylized himself as a liberal with some unique opinions, it's that he's increasingly becoming just a pure right-winger. So using Dave Rubin to criticize having unique takes is a bit weird. When you actually look at the things Dave Rubin says, it's pretty clear he doesn't have unique takes. Indeed, as soon as he began to have some unique takes as a liberal, he very quickly began to become just a bog-standard conservative. So while obviously nobody is saying that having a unique take in itself makes you smart, it is definitely undeniable that the less easily your politics can be described by a pre-packaged label, the more likely it is that you came up with your own beliefs based on a variety of sources and viewpoints, entirely driven by the evidence and arguments. If this wasn't the case, you'd have probably just picked a label and stuck with that. Mostly because having a series of unique takes probably requires a series of very specific beliefs about how things should be done, and I'd imagine that to have such specific beliefs, you must be at least a bit well informed. And of course, pointing to somebody like Dave Rubin as a counter to this makes no sense, since Dave Rubin is very dumb and was also himself literally incapable of holding to a nuanced political viewpoint from a variety of sources, and thus defaulted to just being a conservative. In fact, I would argue that David Rubin is pretty good proof of the intrinsic intelligence of being a political butterfly, not committing to any particular label or ideology, because he, an immensely stupid person, seems to have tried to do that and been unable to do it. By contrast, you look at somebody like David Pakman. Pakman is a really informed and intelligent guy, and he also does have plenty of unique takes that would go against the standard progressive left. Or even look at Vorsh vs. Destiny. Destiny is a much more skilled, informed, and overall intelligent debater than Vorsh. I made a video about Destiny recently, and Destiny didn't really make any immensely stupid points in the video, which is in stark contrast to Vorsh. And of course Destiny also has plenty of controversial hot takes. Meanwhile, let's never forget that Vorsh's go-to example of a controversial hot take he has was that he found the noise uwu annoying. So yeah, I'm just going to say that every bit of evidence I've seen has suggested that people who have at least some controversial, unique hot takes that go against the pre-established narratives of your standard political positions tend to be much more intelligent and informed than people who reliably agree with every single tenet of such political positions. On that note, I get the impression that Tom Nicholas reliably agrees with every single tenet of such political positions. 3 final things. Firstly, throughout this video there's an ongoing sketch about how Nicholas is getting cancelled for doing an offensive impression of French people. I find it weird that even within the video he's making to try to suggest the Twitter mob is actually rational, he presents them as totally irrational and easily offended. It just seems like a weird choice. Secondly, I've pointed this out before, but when Anita Sarkeesian was attacked back in 2014, loads of anti-feminists characterised the harassment she endured as criticism. It's just funny how much things change and yet stay the same. I see so many people euphemistically describe J.K. Rowling as being on the receiving end of criticism, with no mention of how vitriolic it is, and it's just impossible for me to disassociate that from Gamergate, when female gaming commentators and developers were being attacked, and it was described by the likes of Sargon and Thunderfoot as mere criticism. And thirdly, finally, Shire is gone. Basically, credit to Androphobia for making a video on this, because obviously Shia LaBeouf has been a regular part of this channel's branding, but apparently there are quite credible accusations that LaBeouf has been abusive and controlling to his past girlfriends. And I say quite credible in that even LaBeouf has come out and basically admitted that they were true, albeit in the process of making excuses for it. So with that said, I don't really want to have Shire at the end of my videos anymore. I didn't mention this in my last video because I figured I'd mention it here just to clarify. This isn't cancel culture. Like, I feel as if some people might say it's ironic that I'm dropping Shire from the end of my videos while also criticizing cancel culture. However, obviously cancel culture has never been about abuse, and it's also never been about featuring somebody in your own content. So yes, bye-bye Shire. I'm going to just have a regular end screen now, although I will say that if somebody wants to make a better end screen, they are welcome to. Thank you to my current patrons Hannah, Kirsten, Stephen, Nancy, Rubble, Lizu, Jessica, Constant, Adriana, Harper, Alex, Leica, Jane, George, Katie, Ryan, Vishnuvius, that feminist stuff I've warned you about, Lily, Emily, Frederico A, Evan, Philip, Anna, Sophie, Jamie, Pastor, Lena, Julie, Dustin, Rashmi, Marion, BJ5181, sorry I got your name wrong, Joshua, Marina, Sam, Sarah, Valerie, Kathleen, GLN. You're all very appreciated.